In 1949, the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote that one is not born, but rather becomes woman. She meant that society builds the role called woman. It is not simply born. But the line works on a smaller, more political question too. Because in every age, in almost every society we know of, one is not born a ruler if one is born female. The rule has been remarkably stable across cultures. The exceptions are what we follow today. 4 women across 3,500 years who took a throne or an office that their society had not designed for them, and who used the time they had to build something the world is still reading, looking at, or living inside. Risto here. History buff, not historian. English isn't my first language. That's kind of the point. Learn a little, laugh a little. That's the deal. Human nature doesn't change, and neither does the plot. History rhymes and keeps the receipts. I mean, somebody always writes it down. An Egyptian queen who put on a false beard and renamed herself Pharaoh. A Chinese concubine who became the only woman in 5,000 years of Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. A German princess who took the Russian throne by overthrowing her own husband 8 days before he died of, let's say, hemorrhoidal colic. And an Icelandic actress, divorced, with one breast and an adopted daughter, who became the first woman in the world elected head of state by direct popular vote. Let's start in Egypt, around 1478 BC. The royal family of the 18th dynasty had a problem. The pharaoh Thutmose II had died young, leaving the succession to his only son, a boy of 2 or 3, also called Thutmose, born not to the king's principal wife, but to a secondary concubine. Egyptian custom was clear: a boy could not rule. A regent had to be appointed until he came of age. The natural regent was the king's principal wife, his half-sister and queen consort, Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was about 25 years old. She had been raised in the palace as a daughter of one pharaoh, sister of another, wife of a third. She knew the court better than most courtiers. For the first 2 or 3 years, she ruled as a conventional regent, in the name of her stepson. And then, gradually, between the 7th and 9th years of his reign, something unprecedented happened. She had herself crowned pharaoh. Not regent, not queen, pharaoh. She took the full 5 royal names. She had herself depicted on temple walls in the male pharaonic costume, the shendit kilt, the nemes headcloth, and the false ceremonial beard. The artists had no convention for showing a woman in this role. Some sculptures show her with a male body and feminine facial features. Others, later in her reign, show her almost entirely as a man, with only an inscription identifying her as His Majesty herself. She reigned for about 22 years, and here is the part that matters. She did not just hold the throne for a stepson too young to claim it. She used it. She built. The temple at Deir el-Bahari, at the edge of the Theban desert, 3 terraced colonnades cut into the cliff face, one of the most beautiful pieces of architecture surviving from any ancient civilization, was her funerary complex, planned and largely built during her reign. She restored temples that had been damaged or neglected during the Hyksos period. She commissioned obelisks at Karnak. 2 still stand today, among the tallest standing obelisks in the world. And she sent a trading expedition unlike any Egypt had organized in living memory. 5 ships down the Red Sea to a land the Egyptians called Punt, probably modern Somalia or Eritrea, though the exact location is still debated. The ships came back loaded with myrrh trees, frankincense, ebony, ivory, gold, leopards and giraffes. The voyage was commemorated in extraordinary detail on the walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahari, where you can still see the carved reliefs of the African villagers and the Egyptian sailors meeting on the foreign shore. When she died, around 1458 BC, her stepson, Thutmose III, now in his 30s, and one of the most successful military pharaohs Egypt would ever produce, finally took sole power. About 20 years later, he ordered her name and image chiseled out of her monuments. Her statues were broken and buried in a pit. For 3,000 years, Egyptologists assumed he had erased her out of personal hatred. Modern scholarship has quietly retired that theory. The erasure happened far too late to be personal. It was a dynastic operation, designed to clean up the succession for his own son by removing the awkward precedent of a woman pharaoh from the record. Nothing personal, just politics. The effect was the same. Her name disappeared from history until 19th century archaeologists started finding the chiseled-out cartouches and asked who, exactly, had been so important that someone had wanted her forgotten. We jump forward 2,150 years to China, around the year 670 AD. A woman in her mid-40s was effectively running the largest empire in the world. Her name was Wu Jiao. She had begun her career at 13 as a junior concubine of the Emperor Taizong, founder of the Tang dynasty. When Taizong died in 649, custom required all his concubines to be shaved and sent to a Buddhist convent for life. But the new emperor, Taizong's son, Gaozong, had noticed her at the funeral and had her brought back to the palace. Within a few years, she had displaced the empress consort, married the emperor herself, and was sharing imperial administration with him. By the 660s, Gaozong was chronically ill, possibly from strokes, possibly from being slowly poisoned. The sources are not in agreement. And Wu was effectively governing. When he died in 683, she ruled as regent in the name of two of her own sons in succession, deposing the first when he displeased her. And in 690, at the age of 65, she did something no woman in 5,000 years of Chinese history had ever done. She declared the Tang dynasty officially ended, proclaimed a new dynasty under her own name, the Zhou, and crowned herself emperor. Not empress, not regent, Huangdi, emperor, the title reserved for men. She reigned in her own name for 15 years. What she did with the throne was substantial. She extended the empire westwards into Central Asia, recovering territory that the Tang had lost. She reformed the imperial examination system that selected senior officials, opening it more aggressively to candidates from non-aristocratic backgrounds, which weakened the entrenched clans that had controlled Chinese government for centuries and laid the foundation for the meritocratic bureaucracy that would govern China for the next 1,200 years. She patronized Buddhism on a scale not seen before, building the Longmen Colossal Buddha at Luoyang, a 17-meter-high carved figure that still sits in the cliff today, and whose face is said by tradition to be a portrait of Wu herself. And then there is the other side. From around 684 onwards, Wu installed a network of copper boxes in the capital, inviting any citizen to drop anonymous denunciations into them. Informers travelled the empire at public expense. She built up a secret police under two officials, Lai Junchen and Zhou Xing, whose cruelty became proverbial. Zhou Xing invented an interrogation technique involving sealing a prisoner inside a large heated jar, which entered Chinese language as the saying, "Please step into the vat of your own creation." According to the great medieval Chinese history, known as the Comprehensive Mirror, during the 690s, 36 senior bureaucrats were executed or forced to commit suicide, and 1,000 members of their families were enslaved. Older sources, less reliable, also accuse her of having suffocated her own infant daughter to frame a rival concubine, a claim that modern historians treat with caution, but that has never quite been ruled out. In 705, in her 80s, she was forced to abdicate by a court coup. She died a few months later, requesting only that she be buried with her husband Gaozong as his empress, not as emperor in her own right. In front of their joint tomb at Qianling, she had a stone monument prepared. It stands today, 8 meters tall, 90 tons of carved limestone, decorated with dragons and clouds. It is one of the largest imperial stelae in China. It bears no inscription at all, no biography, no list of achievements, no defense. Tradition says she ordered it left blank, with the instruction that future generations should be the ones to judge her. A 1,072 years later, in Russia, on the morning of the 28th of June, 1762, another woman was about to do something nobody had quite expected her to do either. Her name was Sophie Friederike Augusta of Anhalt-Zerbst. She was a minor German princess, brought to Russia at 14 by the Empress Elizabeth, married off at 16 to Elizabeth's nephew Peter, the heir to the Russian throne. She had been baptized into the Orthodox Church and given the name Catherine. By her late 20s, she had learned Russian fluently and made herself a connoisseur of Russian culture, while accumulating friends and lovers in the Imperial Guard. Her husband, by contrast, had made himself spectacularly unpopular. Peter III had come to the throne in January 1762. Within 6 months, he had insulted the army, the church, and most of the aristocracy. He admired the King of Prussia more than his own country, and made no secret of it. On the morning of the 28th of June, Catherine left her summer palace at Peterhof, escorted by a small group of officers from the Izmailovsky Guards. She rode into St. Petersburg in the green uniform of a guards lieutenant, her hair loose under a soldier's hat, on horseback at the head of 14,000 troops. By the end of the day, the army, the Senate, the Synod, and the city of St. Petersburg had sworn allegiance to her as Empress of all the Russias. Her husband was arrested without a fight. 8 days later, on the 6th of July, Peter III died at the country house where he was being held. The official cause was hemorrhoidal colic. Nobody in Europe believed it. He had been killed in a drunken scuffle by one of Catherine's officers, probably Alexei Orlov, possibly on her instructions, possibly without. Catherine never explicitly ordered his death, but she did not punish anyone for it, and she was the only person in the empire who benefited from it. She would reign for 34 years. And here again is the part that matters. She used the throne, and that is why she is remembered as the Great. She wrote, with her own hand, the Nakaz, the Great Instruction, a long legal and political document drawn from Montesquieu, Beccaria, and Voltaire, intended as the foundation for a complete reform of Russian law. The reform itself was largely blocked by the realities of Russian politics. But the Nakaz circulated across Europe and made her, in the eyes of the Enlightenment, a philosopher queen. She founded the Smolny Institute in 1764, the first state-financed school for girls in Europe. She corresponded for years with Voltaire, brought Diderot to St. Petersburg, and bought his entire library to give him a pension, and laid the foundations
of what is now the State Hermitage Museum. She annexed Crimea, partitioned Poland, expanded Russia to the Black Sea. By her death in 1796, Russia was unmistakably one of the great powers of Europe. The shadow on her reign, and it is not a small one, is that for all her Enlightenment correspondence, she extended serfdom rather than reduced it. Several million Russian peasants who had been free at the start of her reign were serfs by the end of it. The Empress of Letters and the Empress of Estates were the same person.
And the last story is the most recent by far. On the 29th of June 1980, in Iceland, a country of about 230,000 people in the North Atlantic, 4 candidates stood for the presidency. 3 were men, a former ambassador, a former member of parliament, and a doctor. The 4th was a 50-year-old woman named Vigdís Finnbogadóttir. Vigdís was not a politician. She had studied French in Grenoble and the Sorbonne, taught French literature in Reykjavik, directed plays at the Reykjavik City Theatre, and presented French language programs on Icelandic state television. She was divorced. She had a daughter, Astridor, whom she had adopted as a single woman in 1972, which had required a special legal exemption because Icelandic law at the time did not allow unmarried adoption. And in 1971, she had been treated for breast cancer with a mastectomy. She entered the race late, persuaded by a women's committee that no woman in Iceland had ever stood for the presidency before, and that someone ought to. She ran with no party backing. The polls had her in 4th place. One of her opponents, in a televised debate, suggested that the country could hardly be governed by a woman with only one breast. She answered on camera that she had no intention of taking the Icelandic people to her breast. She was offering to govern them, not to suckle them. The line went around the country in a single evening. On the night of the 30th of June, with 33% of the vote, she won. She was the first woman in the world to be elected head of state by direct universal suffrage. 20 years earlier, in 1960, a Sri Lankan widow named Sirimavo Bandaranaike had become the world's first female prime minister of the modern era, but she had been chosen by her late husband's party in the wake of his assassination and confirmed by parliamentary majority. Vigdís was different. She presented herself. The Icelanders chose her against 3 men. She would serve 4 terms, 16 years, until 1996. She remains, to this day, the longest-serving elected female head of state in the world. What she did with the office was something nobody had anticipated. The Icelandic presidency is largely ceremonial. The real political power lies with the prime minister. So Vigdís turned the symbolic role into a cultural one. She used every visit, every speech, every state occasion to defend the Icelandic language, which she considered the soul of a tiny nation surrounded by larger languages. She planted trees, hundreds of them, in every Icelandic municipality she visited. By the end of her 16 years, more than 1 million trees had been planted in her name, across a country which had lost most of its forest centuries earlier. She became a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for Languages after she left office, founded the Vigdís International Centre for Multilingualism in Reykjavik in 2017, and at 96 is still alive in 2026, the oldest living head of state alumna in the world. The shadow on her presidency is harder to find than for the others. The closest one can come is the personal price. The breast cancer in her early 40s had effectively ended any possibility of biological motherhood. The marriage had ended in divorce. The country had become, in some sense, her family. The actress who used to direct French plays in a small Reykjavik theatre had become the mother of an entire nation. Whether anyone ever knows exactly what that exchange feels like from the inside is something Vigdís has not, in 50 years of public life, ever publicly said. Hatshepsut put on a beard and built a temple that is still standing 34 centuries later. Zetian crowned herself Emperor of China, ran a reign of terror, reformed an examination system that lasted 1,200 years, and left a stone monument with no words on it. Catherine the Great seized the Russian throne by force at the age of 33 and used it to bring Russian culture into Europe, while quietly extending the chains of the peasants whose freedom she had told Voltaire she admired. Vigdís Finnbogadóttir won an election that nobody expected her to win, and spent 16 years planting trees and defending a language spoken by fewer people than live in a medium-sized European city. None of them was born to it. Each of them made it. The rule that women do not rule has lasted for almost as long as written history. The exceptions are still rare enough to remember by name. I'm Risto. Thanks for listening. See you next time. By the way, if you enjoyed this, the easiest way to support the show is to subscribe. That way you won't miss the next one.